All right, so you guys send in some really wild stuff this time. We're diving straight into it. We're talking about Bangladesh and some pretty big changes that have been happening over there.
Yeah, some really interesting stuff happening. We're mainly going to be working with this opinion piece from the Deseret News. Gives a firsthand account of, well, what the author calls the Monsoon Revolution and kind of the aftermath of all that.
Okay, so just to set the stage a little bit, what was the situation in Bangladesh before all this Monsoon Revolution stuff happened?
Well, you had Sheikh Hasina, who'd been in power for a long time, and there was like growing public frustration. I think it started with this idea of cronyism in the government, like with public sector jobs.
Right, so like people getting jobs because they know the right people, not necessarily because they, deserve them.
Exactly. And so you had all these like student-led protests that were kind of pushing back against this, and things got really messy when the police got involved.
Messy how? Like what actually happened?
Well, from what the source tells us, it sounds like the police response was super violent. Like, we're talking over 1,000 young people reportedly killed, thousands more injured.
Whoa, that's a lot of people.
Yeah, and it seems like that really, like, poured gasoline on the fire, Public anger just exploded after that.
And I mean, this is where it gets crazy, right? Sheikh Hasina, she actually leaves the country.
Yeah, she flees to India by helicopter. And it's interesting, the author points out that India had been a pretty staunch ally of hers, even though there were, growing concerns about, like, her government becoming more and more authoritarian.
Okay, and this is where it gets really, really interesting. What happens next is pretty wild. You've got this Monsoon Revolution led by Gen Z students, and they actually convinced this Nobel Prize winner, Muhammad Yunus, to step in and lead this interim government.
Right, and I think what's so fascinating about Yunus is that he's got this huge international reputation. Like, this guy is a serious heavyweight.
Yeah, for those who maybe aren't familiar, like, what makes him such a big deal?
Well, he's known as the banker to the poor, right? He basically pioneered this whole idea of microfinance, giving out small loans to people in poverty so they can start businesses and improve their lives.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that.
He's founded all these social businesses really focused on fighting poverty, and he's won, like, every award you can think of, the Nobel Peace Prize, the Congressional Gold Medal, Presidential Medal of Freedom. He's even been recognized here in Utah.
So to go from, being this internationally recognized figure to leading a country in such a volatile time, that's a big leap.
It is. And I think for you listening, this deep dive is really a chance to go beyond those headlines, to understand why this happened, what people on the ground are thinking, and, what might be next for Bangladesh.
Yeah, it's like getting a peek behind the curtain, right?
Exactly. It's about understanding the complexities of this moment in Bangladesh's history.
All right, so let's go back to the beginning. We know the student protests were a big trigger. But how did that discontent actually turn into a full-blown revolution?
Well, the protests against, like, cronyism and unfair job appointments, that was the spark. But it was a police response that really turned things up a notch. When so many young people were killed or injured, it seems like the anger and frustration just reached a boiling point.
It's almost hard to imagine how intense that must have been.
Yeah, and the author uses this word snowballed to describe how quickly things escalated. It went from these localized protests to a much wider movement demanding change.
And the fact that the head of state had to flee the country, that really says something about how powerful this movement became.
It does. That image of a sitting leader having to escape to a neighboring country, that speaks volumes about how much authority she had lost and how badly people wanted a different future.
Okay, now let's talk more about Muhammad Yunus. This banker to the poor, this global icon. He also had a pretty contentious history with the previous government, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yunus had been targeted by Sheikh Hasina's government for over a decade. They slapped him with all these charges, which many people saw as totally bogus, politically motivated. There was a real chance he could have ended up in prison.
So it's kind of wild that he goes from potentially being jailed under Hasina to being asked to lead the country by the very students who brought her down.
It's a crazy turn of events, right? But it makes sense when you think about it. The author says that Yunus was seen as the most trusted person in the country.
Right, so even though he had this conflict with the government, people still saw him as someone who was, like, genuinely looking out for their interests.
Exactly. I mean, he had spent decades working to improve people's lives, and he had this reputation for integrity and honesty. And his international stature probably helped, too. Like, he was seen as a symbol of stability in this time of chaos.
And it was the young people, Gen Z, who really pushed for him to lead.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's so interesting. It shows just how badly they wanted a clean break from the past, a leader who they could trust to build a more ethical and just system.
So now Yunus is in charge, but the author talks about this Bangladesh 2.0, this hope for a more democratic future.
Hmm.
What are some of the big challenges they're facing in trying to make that happen?
Well, reforming institutions that were, allegedly corrupted under the previous government, that's a huge task.
Yeah, like how do you actually dismantle those systems and create something new?
It's not easy. And then there's the question of when to hold elections. A lot of people in Bangladesh, according to the source, feel like they need to make some serious reforms before they can have fair and free elections.
So like delaying the elections until they can make those changes.
Right, but that could also lead to its own problems. People might get impatient, or there could be opposition to those reforms.
And of course, not everyone is happy with this new direction, right?
Yeah.
Like the people who benefited under the old regime, they're probably not thrilled.
No, definitely not. And then you've got the role of outside players, like India. This gets pretty complicated.
Okay, so walk me through this India thing. What's their role in all of this?
So India was a big supporter of Hasina, right? But now that she's out, the author suggests that India has been pushing this media storm of disinformation about violence against Hindus in Bangladesh.
Whoa, like they're actually trying to make the new government look bad?
That's what the author seems to be suggesting. And apparently, this disinformation campaign has even made its way into U.S. politics.
Early. How so?
Well, the author mentions that Sheikh Hasina's son hired a lobbying firm in D.C. with ties to Trump. And this somehow led to Trump, when he was still a candidate, making this inaccurate social media post about the situation in Bangladesh. And then you had Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy making a statement related to that.
Wow, so this is like a global information war, basically.
It kind of seems that way. It shows how quickly these narratives can spread and how they can influence people's perceptions, even at the highest levels of government.
But the author of this piece, they actually went to Bangladesh to see what was happening for themselves, right?
Yeah.
What did they find that maybe contradicted some of these media reports?
Right. So they go to Bangladesh and they're met with a lot of warmth and hospitality. They even mention that their wife's Pakistani heritage didn't seem to be an issue, which suggests a level of tolerance and acceptance.
Okay, so like on a personal level, they're experiencing this positive vibe. What about the situation with Hindus? Did they find any evidence of violence or persecution?
So when they're in Dhaka, they talk to people and they get this sense that there's a lot of support for Yunus and a real desire for democratic reforms. They even quote this guy, Muhammad Rahman, who talks about how there's this new freedom of expression, which wasn't there before.
That's a really interesting point, that sense of being able to speak freely. It suggests a real shift in the political climate.
Definitely. And when the author specifically asks about the alleged violence against Hindus, they get some really interesting responses.
Okay, so what did people say?
Well, they talked to this group of 30 Hindu women in a village outside Dhaka. And these women basically said that their lives hadn't changed at all under the new government and that they hadn't experienced any violence or discrimination.
So, like, a direct contradiction to what was being reported in the media.
Exactly. And one of the women, Chandra Das, she even called those reports propaganda.
Wow, so clearly there are very different perspectives on what's happening.
There are. And the author's own Indian doctor friend had this really negative view of the situation based on what they were hearing in the Indian media.
Right, like thinking Bangladesh was turning into this terrorist state because of the alleged persecution of Hindus.
Exactly. And it just shows how powerful those media narratives can be, how they can shape people's understanding, even when those understandings might be very different from what's actually happening on the ground.
And it wasn't all sunshine and roses that the author encountered in Bangladesh, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember they mentioned this Uber driver who had some pretty serious concerns.
Oh, yeah. That Uber driver was worried about Hasina potentially coming back to power. Like, even though a lot of people seem to think that was unlikely, this guy was still really concerned about it.
And that brings us to this question of accountability. I mean, the author lists all these accusations against Hasina.
Mm-hmm.
Corruption, extrajudicial killings, disappearances, secret prisons. If Bangladesh 2.0 is going to be a real thing, they're going to have to address all that, right?
Yeah, that's a huge part of moving forward. There's this desire for justice, for holding people accountable for past abuses, but that's also a really sensitive and potentially divisive issue.
And then there's the whole relationship with India. It sounds like the author thinks India needs to completely rethink how they're approaching Bangladesh now.
Right. They argue that India's strategy of trying to get Hasina back in power is not working and is actually hurting their relationship with Bangladesh. They say India needs to start respecting the interim government and focus on building a relationship based on mutual interests.
And with such a huge combined population between the two countries, I imagine that relationship is pretty important, not just for them, but for the whole region.
Absolutely. Having good relations between India and Bangladesh is crucial for stability and economic growth.
So to recap, we've got this incredible story of a country that's gone through a massive transformation. You've got student protests, police violence, a head of state fleeing the country, and then this Nobel Prize winner stepping in to lead an interim government.
Yeah, and it's all happening against this backdrop of intense media scrutiny, conflicting narratives, and attempts to influence international opinion.
It's a reminder that things are rarely black and white, especially when it comes to global politics.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that we need to be really careful about the information we consume, to seek out multiple perspectives and try to understand the nuances of these complex situations.
And I think that's a good note to leave our listeners on. We've given you a lot to think about today, and hopefully you'll continue to explore this story and think about its implications. What does it mean when a country undergoes such a dramatic change? How do international perceptions shape these events? And what's our role as individuals in navigating this increasingly complex world?
It's a lot to ponder, but I think engaging with these questions is crucial if we want to understand the world around us and the sources that are shaping our future.
So keep those questions in mind, keep learning, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See you then.